Okay, so we want to pick back up where we left off before lunch. And we talked about before lunch 3 of the 4 types of agency relationships that a firm could be involved in, right? We talked about exclusive seller agency, and how many firms were involved in a transaction with exclusive seller agency? Just 1. We talked about exclusive buyer agency. How many firms were involved in the transaction? 1, and the firm represented which party? The buyer. We talked about a co-brokered transaction, the 3rd type of agency relationship a firm could be involved in. And how many firms are involved in that transaction? 2, 1 representing each party. And that brings us to the 4th possibility from a firm's perspective, dual agency. Dual agency is a situation that exists when only one firm is involved in the transaction, but both parties have representation. Well, you do the math. If both parties have some form of representation and only one firm is involved, how many parties does that one firm represent? Both of them. It represents both of them. That firm represents both the buyer and the seller at the same time in the same transaction. You need to get that definition like drilled into your soul. It ought to be like something just etched on, you know, if they open your chest up, it would be right there, the definition of dual agency. That's how important that definition is in North Carolina. It is a firm, one firm that represents both the buyer and the seller at the same time in the same transaction. Now remember, I said a firm is a physical location, not a brand, right? So 2 different Keller Williams offices, one representing the buyer and the seller. Is that dual agency? No. That is not. Those are 2 different firms. So we're talking about 2 brokers affiliated with the same physical location. Maybe even 1 broker. It could be 1 person. The key here is it's 1 firm. 1 firm that represents the buyer and the seller. Now notice I have not said that it represents the best interest of the buyer and the seller. Because the truth is, it's not possible to represent the best interest of both the buyer and the seller, because what's in the best interest of the buyer is decidedly not in the best interest of the seller. Does that make sense for you guys? So ultimately, and we've used the tug-of-war visual image a lot, this is dual agency. In every other form of agency, the real estate firm had their hands on the rope and was doing what? Helping pull. Helping pull that load. If you're an exclusive agency, the whole firm is on the side of the buyer and the seller is unrepresented, or the whole firm is on the side of the seller and the buyer is unrepresented. If it's a co-broker transaction, you got a firm on either side of the rope, but they got their hand on the rope and they're pulling. So they're pulling against the other firm. In dual agency, we're just watching the show. In fact, you can't touch the rope. The rope is the transaction, and in dual agency, the firm has to literally go, no. Think of it this way. If you have children, twins, identical twins, and they're fighting with each other, are you going to pick a side? Are you going to take one side, or are you going to try to just be neutral as you possibly can be? What are you going to do? Be as neutral as you possibly can be. Here's the other visual image, and I should probably, I don't know if I really want this visual image etched in your mind, but I'll give it to you anyway. I should probably get doll babies and bring them in here. If I had 2 babies, 1 in each arm, twins, that's like dual agency. The problem is that sooner or later one of them's going to cry and need something. I can't help one without doing what? Putting the other one down. I have to harm one. I have to take my attention away from one. I can't change this one's diaper without putting this one down. I can't feed this one without putting this one down. Does that make sense? So ultimately in dual agency, here's what you do. You stand here and you say, listen, y'all want to figure that out on your own. Whatever the ultimate result is here, it's on you. Because I can't help, and I is the firm, the whole firm. And that's probably the toughest thing for, I think, new people to agency to grapple with, this idea that it's the whole firm that has to literally step back and take their hands off of the thing. The whole firm and everybody affiliated with the firm. So where is the buyer going to turn for advice? Sammy said nobody. That's a good answer. Where's the seller going to turn for advice? Nobody. They're on their own. What are we going to do as the real estate brokers affiliated with that kind of a transaction? Pass information back and forth? That's about it, right? No advice. There's the word. No advice. Remember when Christine asked a question earlier and she said, well, what if they said, what should I do? And I said, well, there's sort of a magic word there, right? What should I do? How should I handle this? Should I do this? What do you think? All those questions become instantly off limits. Now here's the interesting thing. When Christine asked the question, they were off limits because I was talking to somebody other than my client, right? I was talking to a customer. Now I'm telling you this is your client, and there's still those questions that are off limits. Because if I am telling the buyer what they should do, am I not harming the seller? And folks, it extends so deep into things you may not even think about. This idea of not giving advice. What's the single biggest piece of advice we probably give a client in a transaction? What's the obvious thing that we give clients advice about? Not in dual agency, but in exclusive agency. What would be the biggest piece of advice we give most clients? Pricing. Pricing. Whether we're dealing with sellers or buyers, pricing is the biggest piece of advice. Because if we're dealing with the seller, we're going to sit there and we're going to tell the seller, look, this is what other things have sold for. This is what I think we can market your property for. Here's how I think we should handle this offer. Here's what I think you should respond. Would that be the advice you'd give as a seller's agent? And if you're on the buyer side, you're going to say, listen, here's what things have sold for. Here's what I think our strategy should be to get them down to the lowest possible number. That's advice you give on the buyer side. When you are a dual agent, when the firm is a dual agent, and the buyer says, because they're going to ask, well, what should I offer? What's your response? I can't help you with that. You got to figure it out. And then when they finally do make an offer and you present it to the seller, and the seller says, well, how do you feel about this offer? What can you say? I don't have any feelings about this offer. At some point, is somebody going to look at you and go, what exactly is your job here? A rational person would. And that's exactly why you guys should start to shape your idea of dual agency as a last resort. It's legal because it has to be. It's legal because there are times that it's unavoidable. I'll give you an example of what I mean. Let's say we have a one-person real estate firm. Those exist. I mean, I'm pretty close. I'm a three-person real estate firm at this point in time. But let's say we have a one-person real estate firm. And I have been working with a buyer for the last, 2 months. And we've been looking for property. We've made offers on a couple pieces of property. So if we've made offers, do I have a written buyer agency agreement?
Yes.
Yeah, I have to, right? Because we have to put it in writing to present an offer. So they are my client. I have a written agreement with them. I owe them all those fiduciary responsibilities. Is it likely that I'm going to know some personal confidential information about this person? What they're qualified for, how much they plan to put down, how much cash they have available, what they can actually afford. All those things are going to be things I'm going to probably know. And that's fine because one of the things we owe our clients is loyalty, which means doing what with that information? Guarding it, safekeeping it. Yeah. So there's no problem with me knowing that. Well, I get a phone call from a previous client that says, hey, my neighbor's thinking about selling their house. Would you be interested in talking to him? And I say, sure. And I go over and I meet with the neighbor. Now, this is a townhouse in Cary. And we sit down, I look at the townhouse, and it's cute, and I think, this is nice, and so we talk about it, and they ultimately decide they want to list with me. And so I take the listing, I get a written listing agreement, because remember I have to have that right away with a seller. So now I have a written agency agreement with this seller, and I spend a couple weeks getting pictures taken and getting the house cleaned and ready to go and ready to put on the market. And we put it on the market, and within an hour of it hitting the market, I get an email from my buyer client. Now they've been looking in North Raleigh the whole time. We've never once viewed a house in Cary. They've been looking in North Raleigh, North at Briar Creek the whole time. And they sent me an email and said, hey, we saw this house that just hit the market. What do you think about this one? And lo and behold, what is it? It's my listing that I just put on the market in Cary. And I respond back to them and I say, I didn't think you guys were interested in Cary. And then their response is, well, we've talked about that and we haven't found anything in North Raleigh, so we thought about spreading the search out a little bit, and this one just happened to pop on the market today. And I think, yeah, no joke, because it's mine. Folks, are we in dual agency there? Absolutely, and it's unavoidable, because at no point did I even have a warning sign that it was coming. Does that make sense? It would be different. Here's the thing, if I had gone into that listing presentation and I walked in the door and I thought, this is it. This is the one. Like, because I've been working with these people for 2 months and I know exactly what they're looking for. If I had walked into a North Raleigh townhouse and I'm like, this is it. See, I wouldn't even have continued the conversation about the listing. Here's what I would have said to the seller. I would have said, listen, I can save us all the trouble. I've got a buyer who's interested in your property. Would you be willing to pay me as a buyer's agent? What am I offering them the opportunity to be? FSBOs. I'm offering them the opportunity to be unrepresented in the transaction, and they would be paying me simply to represent who? The buyer. And I owe that to them, because I shouldn't continue the conversation with them about listing their property knowing that I already have a buyer for it. We should get that out of the way first. But see, I never even have a warning sign about that with this one, because this is somewhere that my clients have not even been looking. And now all of a sudden here we are. I have a written listing agreement, I have a written buyer agency agreement, and this buyer that I represent, that my firm represents, wants to see my listing. That's dual agency. And that's why it's legal. Because there are times when it just happens. It's just, you'd be surprised the number of times when it just blows up out of nowhere. You're like, whoa, how do we get here? Yes, ma'am.
I know this wouldn't be anything regarding the test, but just FSBOs in general. So, okay, for example, to avoid dual agency, you are an exclusive buyer, sub-agent, whatever, and they want to see FSBO, and then you make an agreement, you talk to the owner of the home and say, can I show it? And then how do you come up with a way to still receive compensation? Or,
how do I get paid?
Yeah.
You like money?
Becoming.
God, you're so selfish. You want to get paid. I don't know.
Well, I mean,
It is the whole point. You're exactly right. So that would be part of the conversation. When I call that seller, I would say, now I have a buyer who's interested in viewing your property. Would you be willing to compensate my firm if my buyer were to purchase your property? And most likely their answer is going to be what? Yes. Most for sale by owners have already decided they're going to pay at least a buyer's agent. And assuming they say yes, I'm going to write up an agreement between my firm and the seller that says, we don't represent you. There's actually a pre-printed form for it. It's called an unrepresented seller agreement. And it says, our firm doesn't represent you. You're not hiring us. However, we represent this buyer, and you list the buyer's name. And you've agreed that if this buyer purchases your property, you'll compensate us with this much money. Does that make sense? Could the seller say, no, I'm not paying you? Sure they could. And so then I'm going to go back to my client, the buyer, and say, well, here's the deal. They're happy to have you look at the property, but they're not willing to pay me. Now, when we signed our buyer agency agreement, you agreed that if I couldn't get my money from the other side of the transaction, you would compensate me. So if you want to look at it, I'll be glad to show it to you. Just keep in mind, whatever you pay for the property, you're going to have to add my commission on top of that, because you would be paying my commission. And then ultimately the buyer makes the decision as to whether they look. In my experience, a few times I've had that conversation with a buyer, here's not what they said. Don't worry about it. We'll move on. Takes care of itself. Okay? Good question though. Is everybody all right with that? So, this idea of dual agency is an important one because it can happen so easily. But again, view it as last resort, not as a preferred destination. You shouldn't want to be in dual agency. I understand the appeal. The appeal is money. We all get that. But that shouldn't be the driving force in what you do as far as agency decisions go, because it is a huge conflict of interest, and you put yourself at great risk of having a lawsuit whenever you're riding that narrow fence down the middle, because it's so easy. I got you. I know you didn't. I always feel bad when I see somebody's hand. I'm like, I'm not stopping for the next 30 seconds. So, once I see you, you can drop it. I'll come back. But it's so hard to ride that rail. Just as an example, it's not just pricing that you can't give advice about, it's anything. So let's assume they do it magically. They get under contract. They come together on terms. There are going to be other questions that buyer is going to have along the way. Some of them seem so straightforward and simple, but they start with those magic words, should I? Should I have an inspection? Well, see, people seem like, well, the obvious answer is what?
Yes.
Yes, unless I also represent who? The seller. Because what's the seller? If you ask the seller, here's how you know what the answer is. If the buyer asks the seller, Teresa, should I have an inspection done on your house that I'm buying from you? What would you say? Hell no. No, you don't need an inspection. Why would you inspect? Why would you do that? Right? And so therefore, I know that's not an answer I can give to this buyer, because the seller would not want me giving that advice. So, as soon as the seller finds out that I told them they should have an inspection, what's the seller going to say? Why'd you do that? They're mad. Because it's actually better for the seller if they don't have one. Does that make sense? So it's all kinds of advice. And the problem, folks, is it's very easy to mess that up. It is so easy to fall off that fence on one side or the other, and do it without even realizing it. It's just it's just like a natural thing. Somebody catches you off guard. Hey, we were working through stuff right here, and this appraisal thing, do we need one of those? If somebody asks me that and I'm not paying a whole lot of attention, I'll be like, yeah, dummy, of course you need an appraisal. But if I happen to be in dual agency, did I just commit an agency violation? I did, because I just worked against the seller. Or, let's say the buyer has that inspection, and then they send this big list of repairs over to the seller. And the seller asks me this question. Well, do you think I should fix this stuff? I can't answer that. I can't say, I can't do that, because no matter what answer I give, I'm taking a side. If I say, no, I wouldn't worry about it, who did I just hurt? The buyer. If I say, listen, if I was you, I'd fix it all, I just harm the seller. So what I have to constantly say to all these questions is, well, what do you think you should do? Don't you hate when somebody answers your question with a question? It's the most frustrating thing in the world. I asked you the question. That's what I want to say to them. But that's the situation you find yourself in dual agency. Well, Christine, if you think you should have an inspection, then I would suggest you have one. That's the biggest non-answer answer in the world, isn't it? But that's where you are in dual agency. That's what makes it hard. Okay, Sam.
Is that why a lot of firms don't participate in dual agency? There are firms that don't participate?
There are firms that don't, but they're rare. They're rare. And the reason they're rare, it's not because, so there's a big difference between a firm that will not participate in dual agency and a firm that does not want to participate in dual agency. Most firms do participate in it because of the inevitability of some of it. Especially, the bigger your firm is, the more likely it is that dual agency is going to happen. Because remember, dual agency is the whole firm, right? So if you think about a Keller Williams office, for example, they got 200 brokers affiliated with that office. How many listings are they managing at any one given time, do you think? 500? 1,000 in that one office? And how many buyer clients are they working with? 2,000 buyers at one time, maybe? what are the odds that on any given one of their listings, at least one of their 2,000 buyer clients wants to look at that property? It's almost astronomical to think it wouldn't happen. Does that make, you get where I'm going with that? And as we move forward and real estate firms get larger and larger and larger, this becomes even a bigger issue. Because that's what firms are doing, they're getting bigger, not smaller. You know, when I got into business, I was affiliated with one of the biggest firms in this part of the state, Remax Winning Edge in Chapel Hill. There were 32 of us. And that was one of the biggest firms. I mean, I remember telling people, and they said, well, how many agents are you in your office? I'm like, 32. I'm, oh my God, what do y'all do? Sit on each other's shoulders? How are you? But that was a time where everybody who was affiliated with the office actually had a desk and a space to work, and you came to the office. 32 people in one office is a lot of people. You understand that? Now you take a KW office that has 200 agents, and you would think, and they got 200 brokers affiliated with them. And you think, man, I'm gonna go in there, I'm going there, I just want to watch, I just want to see what's going on. You walk in the door, you're like, hello? Hello?
Especially on a Monday or Friday.
Right. I mean, you walk around for an hour and you're like, is anybody here? Am I in like a freaky movie somewhere? Nobody goes to the office anymore because everything's remote now. See, when I got into the business, I didn't have a smartphone. I'm old, okay? I had a Motorola StarTAC, and it was like top of the line technology back then. So if you needed to send an email, which existed, you had to physically go to what? The office. You had to go to a computer. Because not only did you not have it on your phone, there was no internet connection anywhere else, you know? And when you were at home, you might have an internet connection, or when you were at the office, there was no such thing as Wi-Fi. And I mean, you had to physically be somewhere. And fax machines. Everybody used a fax machine, so you needed that stupid fax machine. So you go to the office for that. You couldn't get anything done unless you were at the office. Well, now, what do I need to physically be at the office for? Almost nothing. And so you see that reflected in how these brokerages are set up, and what it's led to is I call them the mega brokerages, you know, 200, 300, 500 brokers affiliated with one office. Well, when you have a state like North Carolina that defines dual agency as one firm representing the buyer and the seller, the bigger the office is, the more likely it is that you're in dual agency at any given time. That's probably a longer answer than you wanted, but yeah. Does that make sense for you guys? Okay? That's why that definition is so important. All right? Obviously, it puts you in a tough position. You need the informed written consent. Notice it says written consent, and it says informed. Informed means they actually understand what's going on. In theory, if the buyer and seller have agreed to dual agency, they should be able to explain to you what dual agency means. They shouldn't be in a situation where they're in dual agency, but they think it's exactly the same as any other type of agency relationship. You should be able to walk up to that buyer and say, hey, can your real estate agent give you advice on this transaction? And they'd be like, no, something about their firm, they represent the seller or something, but I know they can't give me advice. It doesn't have to be a detailed answer, but they ought to be able to at least tell you that much. Yes, ma'am.
When I purchased my first home with the same agent, it was dual agency. She did represent the seller and.
Now I want you to think, and I'm not trying to pick on the agent. I just want to use it as an illustrative point. And you may not remember, when you bought the home, did you ever ask like an advice-based question the whole time? Like, how much should I offer? Or should I get an inspection? Or
yes.
did you ask any of those questions?
Yes.
Were they answered?
She said, well, it was up to me.
Well, that's good. That's a good answer. See, it seems like a terrible answer to the client, but from an agency perspective, that's the right answer. See, what I hate to hear sometimes, we'll have that discussion, I'll ask somebody and say, oh yeah, because here's what the thing is, a lot of brokers have talked themselves into the idea that dual agency just means I give really good advice to both of them. No, it does not what it means. You know, I mean, we've got brokers out there who are, They'll walk into to the buyer and be like, listen now, I really think you need to offer full price because this is going to get a lot of traction. And then the buyer offers full price, and then they go over to the seller and go, you know, I really think you should accept this because this is a full price offer. That is not dual agency. That is breaking every agency law we have right there. You're just not allowed to do it. But some folks talk themselves into the idea, well, it works. So does selling drugs. It's still illegal. There are a lot of things that work that you can't do. Yes, I mean, violating agency law is a really effective way to get stuff sold, but it's still illegal. And so that's what this is all about. It's not about what works. It's about what knowing where the law is and what it was. Let's see your hand, Christine.
So can your firm offer education? If you can't, if you have, obviously dual agency is going to happen, can you say, I can't advise you on this, however, via whatever vendor or customer, we offer classes every Thursday that are for first-time home buyers that educate you on all the things?
Yes, and so here's what I would say about something like that. I think that's a wonderful idea, number one. Number two, the time to have that conversation is before you fall into dual agency. In other words, to simply say if your firm's going to offer that kind of thing, why not make it clear to that client as soon as you start working with them, before you're actually in the dual agency, as a preventative measure, right? It's like we know there's a good possibility. So if I was affiliated, I'm going to use KW again. I'm not trying to pick on them. They're just a big firm. You know, it's like talking about Walmart. It's a big target. If I was affiliated with one of the KW offices in this area and I'm working with a buyer, I know there's a very high likelihood that they're going to want to look at not just one, but several properties that are listed with my firm, right? So if my office offered that kind of educational type setting or whatever, I would say to the buyer, now listen, there's a pretty high chance that you could end up looking at something where I won't be able to give you advice because it's listed by my firm. But you can definitely get yourself educated on what a good offer looks like, what the market looks like. My firm offers these classes. They're available on these days. I highly encourage you to go. And so when and if that happens, they've already got that information so that they can apply it. You can even preemptively prepare them for it. Like, for example, I love to sit down with buyers. I think the worst time in the world to explain a contract to a buyer is when they're actually making an offer. Because when they're actually making an offer, they're so giddy and ready to get it done that they aren't hearing anything. They especially aren't hearing the potential bad stuff. Because all they're thinking about is the granite countertops. Oh my God, you said, I love that kitchen. And you're sitting there trying to tell them about the finer points of, you know, damages in a contract, and they're like, I don't know what he's talking about. Where'd I sign? That's where they are. And you know that in advance because you've done it before. So for me, when I'm working with a buyer, I like to sit down and have an hour to go over those things before you've even looked at property, to explain to them, this is how the contract works. This is how the purchase process is going to work. And I know this is boring, but the more you understand it right now, the quicker we'll be ready to move when you are ready to make an offer. So when you see that house and you love it, we can just very quickly throw something together because you already know how this is going to work. So you could preemptively sort of educate your buyer, your seller, all of them, so that if and when you do fall into dual agency and you have to stop giving advice, they're at least not flying completely blind. You know, so for example, could I avoid the problem of do I need an inspection by simply talking to them before we even go out looking at properties and saying, now, you need an inspection on whatever you buy. Even if you buy new construction, ultimately, you need an inspection, and here's why. You need an appraisal, and here's why. And prepare them for all those things so that when we do end up in dual agency and they say, you know, should I have an inspection? You can say, well, you know, if you remember, we had a conversation about those things earlier, so you do whatever you think is right. But you've given the advice before you were in the dual agency. You see what I'm saying? You can preemptively prepare them for that, and that's a really good idea, especially if you're affiliated with a big firm where you know there's a high likelihood of being in dual agency. Okay? That was a long answer too, but most agency answers are long answers. That help? Okay, good. So we need informed written consent. It needs to be intentionally created. And we need to tell them what they're giving up. That's what it says, disclosure is done to decrease the risk. We need to disclose clearly to these clients that there is a conflict of interest, that there's a major conflict of interest here. That we're not playing around about how much you're giving up. Because truthfully, the number one thing your clients are getting from you in a transaction is your advice. Isn't that the first thing they signed up for? They're sacrificing that in dual agency, so they need to understand that sacrifice. You switch from being their advocate. An advocate just means you're working for their best interest. That's what you do when you're an exclusive agent. You're their advocate. But you switch to a neutral role when you become a dual agent. When the firm becomes a dual agent, you throw it in neutral. And you just sit and watch. You observe the transaction. You make sure what's going on is legal. You make sure that the information that needs to be transmitted back and forth is being transmitted. You provide any assistance you possibly can, but you do not give advice. That's the big key with dual agency, is to step away from the advice. I mean, there's no better way to say it. No advice whatsoever when you're in a dual agency situation. And remember, what is the definition of dual agency? When one what? One firm represents the buyer and the seller. So just as an example, if we said that Bud is representing buyer client, they've executed an exclusive exclusive buyer agency agreement. So they have a written buyer agency agreement. And Bud is a broker affiliate of Penn School of Real Estate Realty. How many of us in here represent that buyer? If we're all affiliated with Penn School of Real Estate Realty, how many of us represent that buyer? All of us. Okay? And then we say, Josh, who's also a broker affiliate of Penn School of Real Estate Realty, has just taken a listing in Garner for 123 Main Street. How many of us represent the seller of 123 Main Street? All of us. Bud's buyer client becomes interested in viewing the property at 123 Main Street in Garner. Can that happen? Only if the seller has given their permission. And how they have to give it? In writing. And the buyer has also given their permission. And how do they have to give it? In writing. Because they have a written buyer agency agreement. Does that make sense to everybody? If they both have given their permission, then that buyer is free to view that listing. But what do both clients need to understand about that transaction for the rest of the way it's going to play out? It's dual agency. So how many of us now are dual agents? All of us. Here's the wrinkle. I didn't tell you that Bud's buyer client that he's working with is his fiance. And that Josh's seller client that he's representing is his mama. Does that change the picture? Not at all. From a legal standpoint, not at all. Does it make it much tougher to execute as a dual agency transaction, though? It absolutely does, because now when offer comes in and Josh has to present it to the seller, Mama's going to want to know what she should do. And what does Josh have to say to Mama? Mom, I can't help you. I can't help. And she goes, why? Why can't you help me? Well, because I also represent the buyer. Oh, baby, I didn't know you had a buyer client. And now he's going to have to do his whole song and dance and explain, well, I don't really have them, but somebody else in my firm has them, and that's dual agency, and that means I can't give you advice. And she's going to look at him and go, huh? Remember, she can't fire you, right? Mutual agreement. And now, does Bud have to have the same discussion with his fiance on the other side? Because she don't want to know what should she offer. And what does he got to say? Baby, I can't help you with that. You're on your own. Does that make sense? It is hard. And I use a very extreme example, but because this is what happens. Maybe not to the extreme of it being the fiance, but here's the thing. Take away the family relationships for a second. Bud is going to feel a natural inclination to try to help his buyer, is he not?
Yes.
Because he has a personal relationship, even if it's not his fiance, even if it's just a regular old client. He's been working with this person for a month. He doesn't know this seller, but he legally also represents the seller. You see how that becomes a tough thing to manage? Because in his heart, what does he really want to do?
Help.
He wants to help the buyer. And the same thing is true for Josh over here, who's got the personal relationship built up with the seller, and he has to explain to the seller, I can't give you advice, when in the back of his mind he's thinking, I don't know this buyer. This is stupid. But he can't do it. It's a line that can't be crossed. Does that make sense? That's what makes this hard. That's what makes it so difficult right there. And it is difficult. I saw somebody's hand up. Yes, ma'am.
So if you have an exclusive agency with a listing, and you have an exclusive, and this person over here has an exclusive agency with a buyer, same firm.
Yep.
If their buyer wants to see this listing, it immediately has to be re-signed as a dual agency.
They both have to give their permission for dual agency.
Okay.
If they haven't already given it in advance. Usually they would give it in advance as part of the original buyer agency. They would simply say, if it becomes necessary, I approve of dual agency.
Okay, but what if they don't? I don't want to say what if, I don't want it to be too broad, but if they don't give that.
If they don't give their
upon that-
permission.
If that happens,
Mhm.
we'll talk about it then.
Yep.
And it happens, and they're like, actually, I'm super uncomfortable with this.
Yep.
And I'd rather be represented by somebody else.
Yep, okay. So, wonderful question. Did everybody get the question? All right. So we got to, let's set it up with real people on hypothetical situations. Let's say Christine is working with this buyer. And they've got a buyer agency agreement, right? We're still paying school real estate firm, right? And everybody's affiliated with it. Christine's got this agreement with the buyer. They got a buyer agency agreement. And they didn't do anything about dual agency when they set up the buyer agency agreement. They said, if this becomes necessary, we'll revisit it at that point in time. So Christine's shown her several properties, several listings from other firms. Now all of a sudden, the buyer wants to see this property that's listed by Sammy, who's affiliated with the same firm. Everybody okay with that? You see where I'm going? Buyer wants to see that property. Now does Christine need to have a discussion with the buyer? Yeah. She's got to say to the buyer, listen, now we talked about when we signed this buyer agency thing, we talked about the fact that you may be interested in something that's listed by my firm. Well, that time has come. This one that you want to see this afternoon is listed by my firm. And I can't show that to you unless you agree to allow the firm to represent both you and who? The seller. And what that means is that we would no longer be able to give you advice in the transaction. And the buyer says, no, I don't agree to that. Here's Christine's response. Then I can't show you the property. I can't show you that property. Because if I show you the property, we are representing you. And we are representing the seller. So ultimately, the buyer's choice is going to be this. How badly do you want to see that property? Because the only way legally at that point the buyer can even look at that property is to approve what? Dual agency. See, it's a tough position for them too. Because ultimately if they say, no, I don't agree to dual agency, well, Christine's just going to say, well, then you can't look at the house. I'm sorry, but that's the way it works.
In regard to her situation, when I think about myself, I've bought and sold about 4 houses.
Mm-hmm.
The first time or two, or maybe almost all of it, I did nothing. So you could tell me all that, and they would just,
Right.
whatever, we like you.
Uh-huh.
So I'm kind of trying to gauge what do people most of the time do.
People most of the time say, yeah, go ahead.
So that's what I would.
They say go ahead because what do they value most of all? See, the relationship, and at that moment, but in that moment, if you're telling them, if you say no, I can't show you the house, what is it that they're making the decision based on? They want to see the property. They want to see the property. And you understand that, and that's okay, as long as you've done your job and explained it to them. I mean, there's only so much you can do to protect them, right? There's only so much you can everybody wants what they can't have. And usually when you tell them, well, I can't show you the property, they'll be like, well, I want to look at it. And you say, well, the only way you can. And so here's the thing, and this is where it's not the worst thing in the world. So this is where I become a little bit of an advocate of dual agency. So I do wear both hats. I mean, I'm not completely anti-dual agency. Remember, when somebody approves dual agency, they're not saying I always want to be in dual agency. They're saying that if the need arises, I want to still be able to have all my options open. I'd rather look at the property at minimum and make a decision on it, even though I know it's dual agency, than not even have the chance to look at it at all. Isn't that really ultimately what they're choosing to do? Because if they say no to dual agency, what they're actually doing is saying no to the property. Does that make sense? And so ultimately, most of them will say yes to dual agency so that they're not shutting down their options. Look at it from the seller's perspective. If Sammy's seller says, no, I don't allow dual agency, what does Sammy need to remind that seller? We're trying to get your house sold, and you just cut out a bunch of who? A bunch of buyers. Because they're going to be buyers that are represented by our firm that would like to do what? That would like to look at your property and potentially make an offer on it. And if you don't allow us to operate as dual agents, what do we have to tell those buyers when they want to look at it? We can't show it to you. So you see, if there's a trade-off there that they make. I'm not telling you there's a perfect answer. What I'm telling you is give them all the information and let them make the decision about what trade-off makes sense for them. I've always sort of taken this outlook. If somebody truly does not want dual agency and completely their skin crawls at the idea of it, what kind of firm should they hire to represent them? Whether they're a seller or a buyer, what kind of firm should they hire? If they do not want to do dual agency, they do not want to find themselves in dual agency, what kind of firm is the least likely to put you in a dual agency situation? A small one. So if you are the type of consumer who looks at dual agency and says, no way, no how, you should be looking for a very small real estate firm. Because the smaller it is, the less likely it is to be in dual agency. Does that make sense for you guys? If you are the type of person who absolutely does not want dual agency, who should you never hire? A big firm. Because big firm, it's going to happen. It's likely to happen. It's going to happen. More often than not, it's going to happen. They got thousands of listings and thousands of agents and whatever it is. There's a lot of overlap there. So ultimately, people, their ultimate choice about dual agency is really just in the firm they hire, the type of firm they hire. You follow me on that kind of a mindset? Now, obviously, they don't understand that. It takes a lot look how long it took me to get y'all to that point. You're not going to have a 5-hour agency discussion with your clients. They would shoot you. They don't want to hear all this. So, and that's what makes this tough. Your challenge is to be able to kind of distill this down into a 5-minute conversation to say, here's the deal. And here's how I do it. Here's what I do. And I did it this way when I ran a big firm. I do it this way running a small firm. When I'm dealing with a buyer, I never have the dual agency conversation until it becomes necessary. Because all I'm doing is terrifying them for no reason at that point in time. I'm warning them about the possibility of something that may not ever even what? Happen. I'm asking them to approve something that we hope, quite honestly, doesn't even come up as a conversation piece. Does that make sense? So I never even discussed it in the beginning. I talked about it when and if it became necessary. If they became interested in one of my firm's listings, then I would say, okay, we need to revisit here. We need to back up and regroup, because before, when you hired my firm, you hired us to represent you exclusively, which basically means we were only representing you. Here's the problem. This thing you want to look at right now, it's our listing. So we already represent the seller, and being fair to them and being fair to you, I just need to tell you that if we show you this property, I can't give you advice, but I also won't be able to give them advice. Are you okay with that? See, at that moment, is it meaningful for them? See, and how long did it take? A minute? 2 minutes? That's the thing, is learning how to do it in a really sort of compressed way so that they can get it, so that they can understand what is going on in that moment. Now, with sellers, for me, it's always been a different conversation, and here's why. It's very easy to have that conversation in the spur of the moment with a buyer, because in the spur of the moment with the buyer's in front of you. You're literally sitting with the person in your car, and they're saying, hey, can we go see this property? Is it pretty easy to have a dual agency conversation with them then? You can do it in the car on the way over there. What if Sammy's seller didn't approve dual agency ahead of time? What if Sammy takes the same approach, says, we'll just worry about it if it happens? And so now Christine has scheduled the showing. So Sammy recognizes, oh crap, we got to get the seller's permission for this. You follow me on this? Is the seller sitting right there across from Sammy at all times? No, what do you got to do? You got to track them down. They're on vacation in the Himalayas some damn where. You know, wherever they all fall off the face of the earth when you need them. So for me, with the seller, it's always been about, let's get this done up front. And so I simply look at the seller and I say this, let me ask you something. If I told you there was a group of buyers, that your choice on those buyers was either to not have them be able to look at your property at all, or they could look at it, but you couldn't get advice from me. Just for that group of buyers, which option would you prefer? That they not be able to look at it at all, or they be able to look at it, but you couldn't get advice from me? What do you think our answer is going to be? I want them to be able to look at it. I said, okay, here's what that's called. It's called dual agency. What that means is, if a buyer who's represented by my firm becomes interested in your property, we would still have the ability to show it to them, with the understanding that because we represent both of you, we couldn't give either one of you advice. Are you okay with that? With understanding that's only going to happen if it's a buyer that we represent that's interested in the property. Every other buyer, you're going to get all my advice. What's the seller likely to say in that case? Yes. Does that make sense for everybody? How long did it take me to explain? And I just went through both buyer and seller. It doesn't have to be overly complex. The key is that you have to understand it. Because to be able to explain it that succinctly to somebody, you have to have a real deep understanding of it yourself. And that's what I've been able to do over the years, because I have such a deep understanding of it. I can give it to them, just the facts, you know, and just give it to them in a 2-minute blurb so that they understand enough of what I'm talking about to make an informed decision for themselves. And ultimately, that works out pretty well, quite honestly. Because it is going to happen. It's going to pop up from time to time. Now, here's the thing, and here's where we open up the door to one. Now, we've been through all 4 choices. Everybody okay with that? We've been through all 4 choices from the firm's perspective. What were the 4 choices from the firm's perspective? Exclusive buyer agency, exclusive seller agency, dual agency, and what? And co-broker transactions. Those were the 4 possibilities from the firm's perspective. You good with me so far? Now I want to talk about the 4 possibilities from the client's perspective. They're pretty close to the same. Here's what gets eliminated from the client's perspective is co-brokered. Because the client doesn't care about the other side. Does that make sense? The client doesn't care if the other side has a representation. All the client cares about is my side, me. Is everybody okay with that? So there's still 4 choices. Look at your 4 cards that I gave you. These are the 4 choices from the client's perspective. Notice they seem very similar. Exclusive seller agency, exclusive buyer agency, dual agency, but rather than co-brokered, what do you see there? Something called designated dual agency. Designated dual agency. Well, first let me focus on that word dual. What is the definition of dual agency? How many firms? Dual agency? One firm. How many clients? Two clients. One firm representing both the buyer and the seller. Well, that's just dual, right? So then we need to answer, what is this designated dual stuff? First thing you need to know about it is still dual agency. It's still one real estate firm representing both the buyer and the seller at the same time in the same transaction. Are we okay with that definition? I'm going to go back to my hypothetical here with Bud and Josh. Remember, Bud is working with a buyer who also happens to be his fiance, right? And Josh is working with the seller who also happens to be mom. But they're both affiliated with the same firm, so we said that was dual agency, correct? And we said it was going to be really hard for both of them to not give advice because they have such a close relationship with the one party they happen to be working with, right? I mean, because here's the thing, and don't forget this. Bud doesn't just represent the buyer. Who does he also represent? The seller. Because everybody represents the buyer and the seller. And Josh doesn't just represent the seller, he also represents the buyer. Even though neither one of them really know anything about that other party, they still legally have this representation. Is everybody following me on that? That is dual agency. Well, for years, when this first came about, real estate brokers said, this is stupid. This is crazy. Put yourself in Bud's shoes. He has to sit there and tell his fiance, I can't give you advice because I also represent some seller I've never met. That seems ridiculous, doesn't it? But it's the way the law works. And Josh has to tell his mom, Mom, I can't help you because I also represent this buyer who I have never met. Is mom going to be happy about that? What if I told you there was another way? What if I told you that the real estate commission agreed that that was stupid? What if I told you that the real estate commission says that if the circumstances are right, we can fix that problem? I didn't say it can always be fixed, but I said if the circumstances are right. We're going to talk about the circumstances in a minute. What would be the best possible solution? Just forget the rules for a second. What would be the obvious solution if we could make it work? Tell Bud he could do what? Give advice to the buyer. And tell Josh he could do what? Give advice to the seller. Guess what? We can't. We can't. Because there's a form of dual agency where I can look at Bud and ask this question. Bud, now remember, who is Bud working with? His fiance. What party are they? They're the buyer. Bud, do you know anything about this seller that would harm the seller in the transaction? Do you know any personal confidential information about the seller? He doesn't even know the seller, much less know any... Now notice, I didn't ask him if he knows any personal confidential information about the one he's working with, because obviously he probably does, right? I asked him about what? The other side. And he said what? No. Good. Bud, I'm the broker in charge. But I'm going to designate you, and you alone, to represent the best interest of the buyer. So what did I just do? I just put him on an island by himself with who? The buyer. I'm going to walk right over here and I'm going to have the same conversation in reverse with Josh. Josh, do you know anything at all personal confidential about that buyer that would harm them in this transaction? What do you say? No. Good. I designate you and only you to represent the buyer's best interest in this transaction. Now, best interest means they can give what? Advice. Here's the thing. Is it still a form of dual agency? Yes, because how many firms are involved in this transaction? Still just one. Here's what changed. When we took that listing, when Josh took that listing, how many of us in this room represented the seller? All of us. How many of us represent the seller now? One. The one that's been designated. When Bud signed that buyer agency agreement on behalf of the firm, how many of us represented that buyer? All of us. When Bud's buyer became interested in that listing, how many of us became dual agents? All of us, until I did what? Until I designated him off. Because here's what I did. I made sure that neither one of them had information that would harm the other, and I put a wall between them. When I designated them off, I built a wall right down the middle of my own firm that's got the buyer on one side and the seller on the other. And it becomes the firm's job to protect the wall. The firm, the broker in charge, and the other brokers, their job becomes to maintain the wall. We guard the wall. What is Bud's job? Represent who? The buyer. He's the only one on this side of the wall. What is Josh's job? Represent the seller. He's the only one on this side of the wall. Where are the rest of us? Guarding the wall. And the wall is there to prevent them from sharing confidential information back. And does that make sense for you guys? Because if Bud doesn't know anything that would hurt the seller, why can't he be peeled off and put on the buyer's team? And if Josh doesn't know anything that would hurt the buyer, why can't he be peeled off and put on the seller's team? Well, the answer is they can. And that's called designated dual agency. Yes, sir?
What if he knows something about my seller, but I don't know anything about the buyer?
So Josh's question is, what if Bud knows something that would harm the seller? Like, for example, here would be a good way that would happen. Josh talks a lot. Y'all notice that about him? He's an oversharer, right? You know those folks? So when he got that listing, here's how he got the listing. He comes in the office. On the day he got the listing, he walks in the office. We got a big meeting going on with everybody in the office. And he walks in and he goes, "Man, y'all got to see this new listing I got. It's my mama's house, but man, it is something else. But I'm going to tell you, she's a little bit overpriced right now, but I think she'll do the right deal for the right person." Now, here's the thing. There's nothing really wrong with everybody in the room knowing that information, because everybody in the room represents what? The seller. But here's the problem with that approach. When I ask Bud now, do you know anything that would hurt the seller, what are you going to have to say? Yeah, number one, I know this is mama. Number two, I know she's overpriced. Number three, I know she'd take less money. And the reason I know all that is because Blabbermouth over there told me. Does that make sense? Here's the problem. Anybody who heard Josh say that cannot be designated to the buyer's side, because they already know information that would harm who? The seller. Does that make sense? So, I'd have to either find somebody who happened to not be in the office that day, or we would have to stick with true dual agency. I would have to say, I'm sorry, we've got to stay in dual agency because Josh is blabbing information all over the office again. Okay. Yes, ma'am, Christine.
So designation does have to go both ways.
Designation has to go both ways.
I needed this to be in effect in '95.
Actually, it came in the '96, so it was right there. Is that making sense for everybody? You guys kind of get the big key here is you cannot be designated if you already have been exposed to information that would harm the other side. And here's why. Remember, when I say that Bud represents the buyer's best interest, what is he supposed to do with any information he knows that would harm the seller? Share it. So we have to make sure he doesn't have any first. We have to ask him, honestly, do you know anything? And so here's what I would say. Keep in mind, the firm gets to decide what kind of agency the firm practices. The Real Estate Commission doesn't force you to practice every type of agency. Some firms don't practice dual agency. Some firms practice dual agency, but not the designated form of dual agency. Some firms practice all options. Okay? if your firm is a firm that practices dual agency, shouldn't you have some rules about how people conduct themselves in the office? See, my firm practiced designated dual agency. You know what my number one rule was for agents in the office? Do not talk about your clients in front of other agents in the office. Period. You can talk about transactions. You can talk about your listings. You can talk about the nuts and bolts of the business. But do not talk about the personal confidence. If you have a new listing and you think it is priced great, it is fine to say that. It is fine to walk in the office and go, listen guys, I got a new listing and you should take a look at it for your buyers because the pricing is awesome. Have I given away any personal confidential information there? But if I walk in there and say, listen, I got this new listing and this guy, he has priced it great because he's got to move, his job just got transferred to Iowa. Is there a difference in those two statements? Absolutely. See, I have poisoned the well with number 2. So as a broker in charge, my rule was, don't talk about your clients. That was my golden rule. Talk about property, not people. Property, not people. Do not talk about your clients in this office, because it's not that I wanted them to not talk to one another. It's that I knew there was always the potential that we could end up in a situation that called for designated dual agency. And if you were talking about your clients, we might not be able to do it. And so I wanted to keep that door open all the time. Is everybody following me on that? Yes or no?
Is there rules as far as who does the designating?
There is, and we're about to talk about those. I want to make sure everybody's got the idea of it down first, and then we're going to talk about, remember I said if the circumstances are right. So we're going to talk about what the circumstances are. Is everybody good so far? Okay? So, this is the little flow chart for what it looks like. You have one firm. And now, let me point out this terminology. I meant to do it earlier. Notice it says we have one firm. It's both the listing firm and the what firm? Selling firm. Welcome to the worst terminology in all of real estate. Even worse than ownership and severalty is this one. You need to write this in your notes. The selling firm represents the buyer. The selling firm is the buyer's side of the transaction. Listing and selling are opposites. That's how I always remembered it. Because I could always remember the listing firm was whose side of the transaction? The seller's. That a listing was the seller's side, and that selling was the opposite of listing, so selling must be whose side of the transaction? The buyer's side. I realize it's confusing, but you need to get used to seeing it. So that's why it says up here, we have one firm, and that firm is both the listing firm and the what? Selling firm. That means the firm represents both who? The buyer and the seller. Is everybody okay with that?
It's an action word, so selling.
Selling, not seller. Right. It's the ing. And here's the thought process behind it. Because I always used to say, who the moron came up with this terminology right here? And here was how it was explained to me years ago. The listing agent puts the property out for sale. They put it on the market. That's the listing. Who actually sells it? Who is actually doing the work of selling it? The person taking who to the property? The buyer. And that's why we call that person the selling agent. The selling agent is the one taking the buyer to the property, showing the buyer the property, selling the thing. That's why we call them the selling agent. So the firm that they work with is called the selling firm. That's where the terminology comes from. Okay? So let's talk about the circumstances. We already talked about the first thing. You can't have personal confidential information about the other side. That's the questions I asked, right? So that's the first rule. Other than that, pretty much anybody can be a designated dual agent. Even a provisional broker. Now, we talked about last week the provisional broker license. Y'all remember that? And we said a provisional broker is somebody who's newly licensed, and they have to be under the direct supervision of who? a broker in charge. Provisional brokers can be designated dual agents. It's okay. There's no rule against a provisional broker being a designated dual agent. There is one rule that has to do with provisional brokers and designated dual agents. See that? Who do you think it would not make sense for a provisional broker to be designated against in their firm? The broker in charge. A provisional broker is supposed to go to the broker in charge for advice, right? For guidance on how to complete the transaction. It would not work for them to be designated against the broker in charge. So a provisional broker can never be designated against their broker in charge. Could two provisionals be designated against each other?
Yes.
Yes. Could a provisional be designated against a full broker in their same firm?
Yes.
They sure could. Could two full brokers be designated against each other?
Yes.
Yes. Could the broker in charge be designated against a full broker in the firm?
Yes.
Yes, even that works. What doesn't work is the broker in charge designated against a provisional broker that's under their supervision. And if you think about it, that logically makes sense. Everybody okay with that? So that's realistically the only rules. The designated brokers can't have a provisional against their BIC, and they can't already have been exposed to personal confidential information about the other side. Other than that, the firm is free to designate anytime they want to. And here's one thing I do want to point out, because I think sometimes people get confused about this. It doesn't have to be one broker. Like, let's say we go back to our same situation here, and Josh is a brand new provisional broker. And I feel a little shaky about him in the transaction. Actually, not only is Josh a brand new agent, but so is Bud. Can I have two provisionals under my supervision be designated against each other?
Yes.
Yes. Here's going to be the problem, though. Who are they supposed to rely on for advice? The broker in charge. I don't want to put myself in a position where I got two people coming to me for advice, because now I'm right back in the same conflict of interest, right? So, here's what I would probably do. I would say, Josh, I'm going to designate you to represent your seller because you don't know anything that would harm the buyer, but I'm also going to designate Leslie, who's one of my full brokers, who's really smart, knows what she's doing, to work with you and the seller. So could I designate more than one person on the seller's team? And over here on the buyer side, could I say, hey Bud, I'm going to designate you and I'm going to designate Dolores to work with you because she's really good on buyer side since you don't have so much experience. Could I designate two people as well? Does that make sense? It's not just one and one. If I want to do two and one, or it's up to the broker in charge who they designate, is what I'm saying. The other thing to do, and this is a cardinal sin on a test, people do it all the time. Josh is a broker affiliate of Pan School Real Estate Realty, and he represents the seller listing at 123 Main Street in Garner. Bud is also a broker affiliate of Pan School Real Estate Realty and has an exclusive buyer agency agreement with a buyer who's interested in making an offer on 123 Main Street in Garner. What type of agency relationship is this? What is it? Is it dual, exclusive buyer, exclusive seller, or designated dual? I'll repeat it. Josh is a provisional broker affiliate of Pan School Real Estate Realty, and he's executed an exclusive right to sell listing agreement with the seller of 123 Main Street in Garner. Okay? Bud is also a broker affiliate of Pan School Real Estate Realty and has executed a buyer agency agreement with a buyer who's interested in submitting an offer on 123 Main Street in Garner. This is an example of what type of agency? Dual agency. Do not make the cardinal sin of assuming that is designated dual agency. The only thing we know for sure is that both clients are represented by what? The same firm. Do not assume that because it's two different brokers, it's automatically designated dual agency. What kind of magic words would you be looking for to signify that it was designated dual? Of course, they could use the word designated, but how about the word advice? If I snuck something in there like, and Bud has been allowed to give pricing advice to his buyer, wouldn't that immediately, like, ding, 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 that can't be dual agency, it must be what? Designated. Here's what I'm telling you. Don't assume designated. If all you know, if the only fact you know is that it's one firm and two clients, and what kind of agency is it? It's dual, which means no advice. Is everybody okay with that? Be very careful of that on an exam. Very careful of that. So again, the basic concept of designated dual agency, designate somebody, one or two or three somebodies to represent each side as long as they don't have confidential information, and those folks are then going to work sort of in the same way as exclusive agents would. They will work to the best interest of the person they've been designated to. Bud would work for the best interest of the buyer. Josh, can they give advice on pricing?
Yes.
Yes. Is Bud going to fight for the buyer to get the best price possible? Is Josh going to fight for the seller to get the best price possible? And that's perfectly okay, even though it's within the same firm, because we have put the wall up down the middle of the firm. Is that a better option for almost any buyer or seller than true dual agency is? Absolutely. Is it a better option for you as a broker as well? Rather than having to try to sit on this fence and not fall off on either side, I think it's much better to actually be on, I find it much easier to be on a team. I hate trying to ride down the middle. It drives me nuts. So it's a good solution for both. It's still dual agency, don't forget that. And make sure that you're making both parties aware that we are in designated dual agency. You still need the written approval of both the buyer and the seller because it's still dual agency. And it's actually got a separate approval, which we'll talk about when we go through the buyer agency agreement and the listing agreement. There's a separate line where you would approve designated dual agency. Everybody got the basic concept down though? Okay? So here's what I want to do, and that'll be the last thing we do today. You might actually get out a few minutes early. Look at that. Just to recap, you've got these 4 cards here in front of you. Those are the 4 options for agency from the client's perspective. Does that make sense for everybody? I want to rank them. I want you to rank them. I want you to do it from the seller's perspective. So I want you to take about a minute, and you've got your 4 cards, and I just kind of want you to stack them top to bottom or put them in order from best to worst from the seller's perspective. Is everybody okay with what the directions are? I want you to rank them. So like 1 through 4. What's number 1 is the best, number 4 is the worst. I want you to put them in order from the seller's perspective. What's the best option for the seller, all the way down to what is the worst option for the seller. All right, talk to me. The first one should be relatively obvious. What is the best option from the seller's perspective? Exclusive seller agency. Because in exclusive seller agency, there's only how many firms involved in the transaction? 1, and whose team are they on? The seller's team. So the only involvement from a real estate firm in the transaction is that they are on my team. Does that make sense? Okay? That's the best possibility from the seller's perspective. Everybody good with that? let's do this in an interesting way. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum. What's the worst option from the seller's perspective? What is the polar opposite of exclusive seller agency? Exclusive what? Buyer agency. That's the one you should have ranked number 4. Because in exclusive buyer agency, how many firms are involved in the transaction? 1. And whose team are they on? The buyer's team. Isn't that the worst possible outcome for the seller from an agent? You see how what this makes it interesting, right? You know, like, because you start to think of it as what's better and what's the worst. Everybody good? So what that leaves in the middle 2 options, which are both what? Some form of dual agency, right? So now the question becomes, which form of dual agency is better for the seller? Is it designated dual agency or true dual agency? Now before you answer, I'm going to give you a differentiation. In designated dual agency, they can get what magic A word? Advice. In true dual agency, can they get the magic A word? No. So which is better from the seller's perspective? Designated dual agency is better from the seller's perspective because they can get what? Advice. So what would be, so that's number 2. What's number 3? Dual agency. And then number 4 would be what again? Exclusive buyer. So let's recap that all the way from best to worst. Number 1, best possible outcome from the seller's perspective is I'm the only one who has representation in this transaction. And that is what? Exclusive seller agency. Does that make sense for everybody? Everybody okay with that? That's the best possible outcome for the seller. The next best possible outcome for the seller is I still keep my representation. Yes, I understand the other person's got representation as well, but I'm still getting some advice. Does that make sense? And which one is that? That's designated dual agency. Number 3 is, well, I don't have anybody working in my best interest, but I also don't have anybody what? Working against my best interest. So I'm kind of in neutral ground for dual agency, which is number 3. And then number 4, which is the worst possibility, is what? Exclusive buyer agency. And the reason that's the worst from the seller's perspective is because everybody's doing what? Working against me. Everybody's working against me. Got a victim complex going on. Does that make sense for everybody? If you were ranking it from the buyer's perspective, would they be similar answers? What would you change? Swap 1 and 4. Swap 1 and 4, right? Everything else will stay in the same place, right? Because from the buyer's perspective, what's the buyer's best possibility? Exclusive buyer agency. What's number 2? Designated dual agency. What's number 3? Dual agency. And then number 4 is exclusive seller. Do you notice something? What's best for the seller is worst for the buyer. Imagine that, right? Are you starting to get it a little bit? This is why I love this stuff. Because when the light goes on, that's when you're really starting to get somewhere in this class. You know, so many, right here today, we probably covered 20% of the final exams. I mean, this is a huge, and we're not done with agency discussions. We will continue this discussion, but we probably covered a full 20% of the exam today with this material. Because it's so important. And it will only, it'll grow, tomorrow will be another 20%. These 2 days are going to be almost half the exam. That's how important agency really is. And so it's really super important that you get it with this stuff. All right? So I know we did not go over your quiz and your math homework. We will do that tomorrow, okay? And tomorrow we will continue the agency discussion. Go ahead and if you would like, if you haven't already, potentially read ahead into chapter 8, because we may get into some agency contracts stuff tomorrow. But good day. I feel like you guys did well. I feel like hopefully your brains haven't melted out of your ears yet, right? Okay? These are big concepts. Do not beat yourself up if you have, you know, like moments of doubt where you don't get, this is all about engaging with them, talking about it. And we're going to have some interactive stuff to do and hopefully keep you engaged with the agency stuff. All right? See y'all tomorrow.
Was it for
A lot of times it is for
Our agency agreement, yeah, no, well, to make an offer, remember, you don't even have to put the buyer agency agreement into writing until you do what? Until you present an offer. So, you can do oral dual agency, oral agency. What you can't do is this is where you have to be careful with this. If I have a written buyer agency agreement, then the only way I can get permission for dual agency is to put that in. What I can't do is oral dual agency on a written buyer agency agreement. Because when I first do the written agreement, I have to choose yes or no to dual agency. I can't change that unless I change it in writing. Better today?
Yes.
6 o'clock.
I've been a property manager for about 20 years. I'm retired.